Hi, my name is Tracy Loskar and welcome to Rescuing Through Resiliency. What we're going to do is look at the idea of resilience as it relates to overall wellness and how we can use that idea to fortify first responders from being affected by traumatic stress responses and the emergency calls they go on every day. The first thing we're going to do is define wellness, and wellness is generally defined as being in good physical and mental health. The model you see before you is the 8 dimensions of wellness defined by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The important thing to note here is all of those dimensions are integrated and overlap. You can't affect one without impacting the others around it. No one dimension operates in a vacuum. It's a double-edged sword. You could work positively to develop one in a good manner, but at the same time, if one takes damage, the others around it will be negatively impacted as well. Why do we need wellness? We need wellness because life's not fair. That two people in the same set of circumstances are going to end up with a different result, and that is not always seen as fair, and this lack of fairness often creates expectations that are never met and create their own type of stress. The other problem we have with the current culture is it tends to be overprotective. We talk about helicopter parenting and bubble wrapping our kids, but the reality is that if society is seeking to protect the individual from emotional pain or stress of any kind, what it does is retard the development of healthy coping skills, and we're leaving the individual absolutely unable to deal with traumatic events of any kind. When we talk about resilience and wellness as a concept, it often gets debunked before it can be tried because it tends to be holistic in nature. It has a more spiritual approach or mental approach. So without hard physical evidence that it immediately works, it's sometimes difficult to introduce past a cultural bias. In order to understand resilience, we should start with stress. And in order to understand stress, our first stop is Hans Seeley. In 1950, he was a researcher who first described stress as the general adaptation syndrome, or stepping on the gas. And here is a really simplistic breakdown. This could be a whole talk on its own on the body's physiology when it comes to a stress reaction, but there's the short version. We're going to start with homeostasis, or your baseline. At the alarm stage, our physiology takes a hit, meaning we have a negative response, our blood pressure raises, our heart rate raises, our eyes dilate. This is fight, flight, or flee, folks. And then we move into the resistance stage where we process that information and mitigate the effects on our body, and eventually depleting our resources, we exhaust and basically need to rest and recuperate. What's important here is to know that resilience affects the resistance stage, stage 2, where we process that information and mitigate the effects on the body. And you should also know that the body can't tell if it's good or bad stress. This is why people are likely to riot when their team wins just as much as if their team loses. It's very interesting stuff. While some people are inherently stronger, resilience is not reliant on inner ability. You don't wake up one day able to be resilient. It's also a learned skill set. We can teach this. It's a multifaceted approach that incorporates things like healthy lifestyle choices and active support networks, both personal and professional, to do that 360 global wellness of both mental and physical health. What happens when it's not enough? Well, then we have a stress reaction. In order to have post-traumatic stress disorder, you need 3 things. 1, you need an adverse environmental or traumatic event that you were involved or exposed to. 2, you need a set of symptoms that falls into one of the 4 categories you see on the slide. And 3, you need those symptoms to sustain more than 3 months after exposure. Post-traumatic stress disorder has been a long time in the making. It was first recognized in the 18th century and described as nostalgia, and up through the world wars as both shell shock and battle fatigue. Today it has its own diagnosis. The DSM-5 classifies PTSD as trauma and stressor-related disorder, and those symptoms are considered red flags for a post-incident. If you want to learn more about the history, I suggest you go to the Veterans Administration website, ptsd.va.gov. It has really good information on the past history of reaching this diagnosis. What do the symptoms look like? The first is re-experiencing. These are the people who have flashbacks, visual and/or auditory hallucinations that cause them to relive the event upon a trigger. You have avoidance, people who will go out of their way to engage in a scenario that mimics the event that initially triggered them. So this could be difficult if their trigger started at work and they're doing the same things every day. Negative changes include negative changes in behavior, anger, violence, depression, failure of relationships, addiction, or hyperarousal. These are the people who have anxiety, insomnia, palpitations, chest pain. They're basically in that stage 1, that alarm stage, all of the time and can't come down. What we learned is it's not limited to wartime events, soldiers and civilian survivors only. First responders are especially susceptible to cumulative events. We learned over the last 15 years that it could be a single or a cumulative event. The nature of their work exposes them not only to the event, but to the background of the event, which sometimes can have an equally damaging effect. We not only know what happened, we know why it happened, and sometimes that is worse. Why are the rescuers at risk? Well, for a bunch of reasons. One, they're young. This is a young person's game. I did see my first dead body at the tender age of 18. I remember it like it was yesterday, and I assure you it was not yesterday. They're entering the field in their teens with immature coping skills to begin with. Culturally, up until the last 15 years, we did not encourage or teach resilience of any kind. It was very much trial by fire. You had to process the information and move on to the next call. There's very little screening for mental health for most emergency agencies, especially in the volunteer sector, which a lot of the United States, especially in the rural areas, still is. Rural and low volume areas face a unique challenge. Very often they can go days, weeks, sometimes even months without a call, and then when they do have a call, the chances of them knowing a family member or being related to the community member in some way is actually pretty good. So they have their own unique set of stressors. And like I said, culturally, we didn't know about it until the last decade or so that it was as big a problem as it was. Regenball et al. Also points out that emergency responders are type A personalities who are driven to succeed and have control issues. Operating in a field where control might not always occur can leave them struggling to cope. All I can say is amen to that. All right, so what happened? 9/11 happened. After 9/11, the focus was on emergency responders, and we had much more in the way of studies and attention and grants and research being done. So what we learned, plus more notably, PTSD finally received an official diagnosis, and we started to realize that the suicide rates were going up. The police have the most research available, followed by firefighters. EMS, as the youngest community, has the lowest amount of research available to out there. However, in the references, there's an excellent systematic review of suicidal studies. Feel free to contact me if you want that information. But basically, it's putting first responders, their suicidal ideation, at 2.5 times the national average. There's a lot of reasons for this. They're already weakened, lack of sleep, not a lot of support, they work multiple jobs, they have a decreased fear of death, and increased access to lethal modalities. All this puts them at very high risk for suicidal actions. Today, however, resilience is integrated in emergency management programs, but it's still going to take time to institute it as a professional culture. So what do we do? How do we build them up? Well, first thing we need to do is advocate. We need advocacy for continued research. We need actual resiliency training. And most importantly, we need access to appropriate crisis intervention for emergency responders that is geared towards emergency responders. They don't like to talk to strangers. Responders need to shoulder their part. They're culpable too. When they're struggling, they need to be able to have a channel, a clear channel that they can respond and ask for help and how they can expedite treatment. And the culture itself needs to change and support a healthy response when people try to get help. Just telling stories and telling them to suck it up isn't the way to do it. We need to start with higher. Healthy lifestyle habits should begin with higher, not after the fact. Access to resources, fostering team dynamics, and train them longer. Give them more support. The CSM model has been proven not to work and actually can drive the trauma even deeper. So what's the conclusion here? We're asking ordinary people to respond to extraordinary experiences every single day. To expect them to come out the other side unscathed is unrealistic. Even if they've chosen this as their profession, it should not doom them as a career without support or structure. Resiliency is possible and necessary, and recognizing it now could save a life. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to contact me with any questions you might have.